Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful. Today is September 17th, 2025. My name is Asia Eaton, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Laura Hernández and Patrick Grzanka about reproductive justice. Laura Hernández is the Senior Associate for SIX's Reproductive Rights Team, where she supports state legislators across all 50 states to advance reproductive rights policies and defend reproductive freedoms. Before joining SIX, she served as the Director of Policy for Planned Parenthood in Florida, leading legislative priorities, defeating over 5 anti-abortion bills, and co-leading Florida's Reproductive Freedom Coalition. Her passion for reproductive rights and justice is rooted in her background as a community organizer during the 2016 elections and various local campaigns, as well as her lived experience as a Latina, immigrant, and first-generation college graduate. Laura holds bachelor's degrees in political science and women's and gender studies, with certificates in public policy and Latin American and Caribbean studies from Florida International University. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, Dr. Eden. So great to be with you.
Patrick Grzanka is a university diversity and social transformation professor of women's and gender studies and psychology at the University of Michigan. His research, teaching, and activism focus on intersectionality, or the interlocking nature of social inequalities, including racism, sexism, and heterosexism. He has been involved in the reproductive justice movement for over a decade and has served on the boards of Planned Parenthood of Tennessee and North Mississippi, as well as Tennessee Advocates for Planned Parenthood. His research on sexual and reproductive health has explored contraception access, promotion, and coercion, as well as abortion attitude, particularly in the wake of Dobbs. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Asia and Laura. Thrilled to be here.
Laura, let's get started with you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in working toward reproductive justice?
Yeah, so my journey in interpretive justice has, it's pretty personal. I grew up in an immigrant household. We didn't really understand the systems in this country, and there wasn't space to talk things about, sex or our bodies. And like many immigrant households, there was just a lot of shame and stigma around these topics. So there really wasn't any sex education and not a lot of support either. Around the same time, there was teen pregnancies in my family, and I remember being so frustrated, not necessarily about the pregnancy itself, but by how much of my extended family was responding with so much shame and stigma. And there really was no conversation about the bigger picture of supporting this family member. And I myself had a pregnancy scare at 15, which was like a year before everything else happened. And I honestly thought that if I were pregnant, my only option would be to have a child. I didn't even know abortion was a thing that existed. And I really only learned about it years later when someone in my family in Colombia really needed one, and I had to keep it a secret from everyone else. And that moment really stuck with me. And then later on, my parents found out I was sexually active, and they tried to help in their own way by sending me to a sex psychologist and gynecologist, which like sounds good in theory, and I think those were great steps. But as a teenager, I felt so much shame and stigma, and it really was hard to tune in and listen to what they were saying. And they were like talking about birth control and my options, and I really just shut down because I again just felt so much judgment coming from my parents. So I tuned them out, and looking back, I'm lucky I was okay. But the reality is that I was navigating all this alone. But then I got to college, and that was when I first got to go to a Planned Parenthood event. And they had a sex educator that was talking to me about, my body, my rights, and my choices. And it felt really empowering instead of shameful. And that event lit a fire under me. I realized then how many people grew up just like I did, without information, without options, and without family support in a sense. And it's what really pushed me into this work eventually, which is when I started organizing with Planned Parenthood in my community. So around sex education, abortion access, Zika prevention education, and for politicians supporting reproductive rights. And from there, I eventually joined Planned Parenthood's state policy team in 2019, which is when DeSantis first started his term. And it's where I began to lobby legislators. So in that time, it's when I really noticed how under-resourced many progressive lawmakers were, especially Black and Latina legislators. So now at six, and through our Reproductive Freedom Leadership Council, which is over 600 state legislators who support reproductive freedom, I get to be part of the solution in a way. I really help them lead for reproductive justice in a bold way, and just to make sure no one really has to go through kind of what I went through alone, and making sure they have the tools they need to lead in their states.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, for the personal vulnerability and talking about how Planned Parenthood helped change your life trajectory and well-being. I saw Patrick smile when he heard Planned Parenthood's name come up. We'll get to that soon. But you've been with SIX now, right? State Innovation Exchange for about 4 years.
Yeah.
Tell us what a day in the life looks like for you there.
Yeah, so my role is really dynamic. I wear a lot of hats. So when most states are in session, which is in spring, I spend most of my days tracking legislation, analyzing and synthesizing it, and across all 50 states. And I provide technical assistance to legislators. So sometimes they're like, I need messaging support on this. Can you help me analyze this bill? Or have you seen these bill introduced in other states? What can I do to prepare? So that's a lot of what my in-session season kind of looks like. But off-session season, I'm mostly planning programs. So one project I've been especially focused and proud of is our RFLC Latina caucus. So for example, the past few weeks, I've been connecting Latina state lawmakers across the country to build a unified strategy for advancing reproductive health rights and justice, but from a cultural lens. So a lot of that work right now involves helping amplify their leadership through media visibility and identifying press opportunities, especially as it's Hispanic Heritage Month right now. But outside of that, I also get to work on model legislation and brainstorming new ways to engage legislators for upcoming sessions, especially the challenges and the shifting, landscape we're seeing in states on abortion access. So it's really about figuring out how effective to be in this moment. And lastly, I think one of my favorite parts about what I get to do right now is plan global delegations for state legislators. We've done around six, and the last one we just wrapped up was to Brazil. So we sent a delegation of US state lawmakers to learn from Brazilian political leaders and activists about the importance of never compromising on abortion and LGBTQ rights, particularly during periods of redemocratization like they went through in the 80s. Both the lawmakers and activists in both countries got to really grapple with the respective conservative movements that are affecting our political processes that are heavily shaped by racism and classism, and how these intersect in the fight for reproductive justice.
Oh, I think you set Patrick up pretty well right there. Patrick, tell me about what you study in plain language. Tell me a little bit more about intersectionality and reproductive justice from the standpoint of a public psychologist.
Well, it's so wonderful and interesting to listen to Laura's journey, which is, of course, different from my own, particularly in so much as I'm a white cisgender man. But there are similarities, I think, in our stories, and in some ways, all roads lead through Planned Parenthood, right? I study the social life of sexual and reproductive healthcare and policy. So, what that means is that unlike a public health scholar or a physician who works in a medical school who might study health inequalities as a consequence of access to abortion care or contraceptives, or who might study the mechanics of contraception, for example. I really think about how sexual and reproductive health care policies and the provision of that healthcare affects people's lives, how they feel, how they think, their well-being, and then on a kind of macro level, the ways that healthcare and healthcare policy produce and sustain inequalities, particularly, as Laura just said, in terms of not only gender, but race, social class, immigration status, and other dimensions of difference. I did not go to graduate school to study abortion or contraception. In fact, neither of those words appear in my dissertation. which was on white people's racial attitudes and emotions. I found myself pulled to this work when I moved to Tennessee in 2014, when there was a ballot initiative designed to essentially tee up the state's trigger ban and then ultimately to outlaw and criminalize abortion in the state, which the Republican legislature was successful in doing. And during those early days of my arrival to full-time living in Tennessee, where I worked at the University of Tennessee, I became involved in the movement by attending Planned Parenthood events. I was really interested in, from a psychological perspective, I was interested in all these activists, most of whom were over age 55. Some of whom had been in the fight in the 60s and early 70s to legalize abortion in the United States. And they found themselves having the same fight or a different version of the same fight all over again. And I wanted to understand their activist life histories and how they viewed this contemporary political moment and their struggles. And so I met a bunch of Planned Parenthood organizers and I told them that I was really interested in doing this project, and they were very nice about it. But they said to me, okay, that's great. And we'll do those interviews with you, but we actually really need you to do like the work that we're doing right now. And we need you in the movement. So I learned one of the sort of, community-based research 101 lessons, which is you don't go in with your own agenda. You got to listen to the community and what they need. And so that was the beginning of my story. Within a couple of years, I published with a graduate student, Carrie Frentel at UT, the first paper in a mainstream counseling psychology journal that addressed reproductive justice. And the rest is kind of history. I worked on contraceptive promotion on a big multi-sided project on long-acting reversible contraception promotion for many years with collaborators at Arizona State and University of South Carolina. And I've been doing a lot of abortion attitudes research since then, particularly in the wake of Dobbs.
Thank you, Patrick. And Patrick, what does a day in the life look like for you in academia and straddling the academic activist life?
I think that's such an interesting question, AJ. It can sometimes be hard to talk about what you do because it's sort of like the air that you breathe, and you just sort of take it for granted. So as I've been thinking in preparation for this conversation, studying and working for reproductive justice is really an everyday, all day endeavor for me. It touches all the work that I do. So, for example, right now I've recently moved to the University of Michigan, and I'm starting my research team here. And one of the things that we're working on, which I think is a great example of the kind of stuff that I do as an academic, is we're going to conduct a systematic review of the 300 or so academic papers that have cited a really important 1992 paper that was published in the Journal of Social Issues, which happens to be the flagship journal of the academic society of which I was formerly president, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. This 1992 article legitimated, it wasn't the first to talk about it, but was the first to legitimate it in an academic publication, the concept of post-abortion syndrome, which is a made up construct by activists out of the crisis pregnancy center movement to stigmatize abortion and people who have abortions and to claim that abortion causes negative mental and physical health consequences, not only for the people who have abortions, but the people around them, specifically their male partners and their abortion providers. And so post abortion syndrome emerged in the 1970s and 80s in the discourse, but it became published in 1992 by this academic society that I'm a part of, that you're a part of, Asia, that dedicates itself to promoting social justice. But somehow this paper made it through and then gave fuel to anti-abortion activists who cited this paper and many of its sort of consequential manifestations in various really consequential cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and transformed the landscape of abortion access in the United States. And so what my students in my lab and I are doing is documenting all of the ways that this paper has been cited in the academic literature. So there's quite a bit of legal studies work on how post-abortion syndrome has traveled through the courts, but less known about how it's traveled through science. So that's what we're going to be working on all academic year. But In addition to that, I'm meeting with students. We're working on revising another student's dissertation on peer sex educators, Laura, like the kinds of people who you interfaced with early in your career. We did an amazing project. One of my students did an amazing project, ethnography during the pandemic on peer youth sex educators in East Tennessee. And I'm working with a collaborator in the College of Nursing at UT on writing up a series of papers that will illuminate how young people in Tennessee are making sense of their reproductive lives and their futures in the wake of Dobbs and the full-scale criminalization of abortion in Tennessee. I mean, if that gives you a sense, I do research and work that's not expressly, let's say, about abortion or contraception or sexual and reproductive health more broadly. But it's hard for me to think of a single thing that I do as an academic that's not informed by the reproductive justice framework or that doesn't reflect my commitment to using the tools of social science both to understand the causes and consequences of reproductive oppression, but also to produce knowledge that can help us make the world a more just, fair, and equitable place.
Laura, I saw you light up when Patrick was talking about post-abortion syndrome, and I was interested to ask you more about how stigmas and myths show up in the work that you do. You talked about abortion stigma, you talked about teen pregnancy stigma. How does you and your organization grapple with these issues?
Yeah, so we're seeing, federally this taking hold with the new health secretary, just spewing misinformation and disinformation into the ecosystem, the media ecosystem. And even before he was health secretary, under the previous administration, state legislators have been, trying to fight, trying to like really find a way to combat the misinformation that their constituents talk to them about, right? Whether it's around birth control specifically or like the post-abortion syndrome. That's something that we're seeing trending in a lot of states and being led, right, by a lot of these anti-abortion organizations. As Patrick mentioned, these are studies that from a long time ago and not necessarily always upheld in academic standards. And so it's a challenge that we're seeing daily, just fighting the misinformation in a very volatile landscape in many states, even in progressive states, quote unquote. They're fighting their own colleagues, right? Their own colleagues know that they're spewing misinformation, and just in the discourse of it all, they're challenging with basically trouble presenting facts. And even though they are presenting facts, they're not being taken as seriously, right? And bad policy is still being passed with disregard to the facts, with disregard to medical professionals, to people's personal stories. And I think that's something that has burnt out a lot of the state legislators, unfortunately. And, right now, a lot of them are just returning to connecting with their communities. They know that, okay, right now, maybe I can't reach my colleague across the aisle. They're going back to the communities, talking, having like town halls, all these social media, live kind of stuff on Instagram, and being at the center of it all with them and just trying to do their best to communicate to the constituents. Okay, a lot of states have, for example, passed bans on providing information around abortion and how young people, especially too, can get access to abortion care. So legislators are trying to navigate this tricky legal landscape around how they can provide information around abortion care, that's whether in their state or outside of their state. And I think one huge challenge we're seeing is maintaining access for young people. I think that is a huge concern in terms with parental involvement and parental involvement laws, and then also battling the parental rights movement that really doesn't have the best interest of young people at all, right? It's about control, and it's very hard to kind of combat that. And something I saw up close when I was lobbying, right, in Florida, and just seeing the intersection of the parental rights movement are the same people behind defunding public schools, behind taking away abortion access, and also preventing queer students, right, from being able to use their preferred pronouns and all these stuff. It's the same movement. And it's such a hard battle to kind of confront when they're so well funded as well. Just really being able to lead in the media landscape right now, I think it's something that legislators are having kind of a hard time trying to get out there and be combating this misinformation.
Thank you for doing the work, Laura.
Patrick, what can you say from the standpoint of psychological science around addressing mis and disinformation around reproductive justice or the polarization
Mm.
or any of the challenges that Laura's facing?
Oh my gosh. I mean, one of the things that I think has been really destabilizing for those of us who work in the relatively mundane world of academic research is how the rise of myths and disinformation, which are related but not identical concepts, has completely transformed civil discourse into something that's almost unrecognizable from the ways that we discuss and debate ideas in academic scholarship. Laura, I'm reminded of all the reporting that we've seen over the past several months of reports being submitted to Congress that are obviously generated by AI, that have fake citations, and that have spurious claims that are really difficult in the moment, in the heat of, let's say, congressional testimony or floor debates to debunk. And I think it's unrealistic to expect our legislators to be scholarly experts or able to debate these concepts and to fight mis and disinformation live as if they're a pundit and that's their only job to have expertise in this particular domain and to be able to fight with someone who's trained their entire life and career to promoting stigma, for example, around abortion and unsubstantiated and non-scientific claims about the consequences of abortion on an individual's mental and physical health. And so, where we come in, I would say, Asia, is to help support people like Laura and activists around the country to provide information, good information, and training to the people who are in positions of power, who have microphones that are bigger than ours, and who can make an impact. We have to support them. We cannot expect that individual state and local legislators, for example, are going to become experts in reproductive justice, who are going to know that post-abortion syndrome is not in the DSM and it wasn't created by psychiatrists or even academic psychologists, but by activists who wanted to codify an idea, again, a non-scientific idea that's not based in data, but just is based in the interpretation of certain findings to create a lie and then to make that lie sound really fancy using psychological language. We can't expect people to do all that kind of research to know that. So we've got to give it to them, and we have to give it to them in ways that are digestible and easily transmittable and that can land in the discourse. That requires public psychology that you alluded to before, Asia, that you've been a huge proponent of, that this podcast is an example of. And it involves collaboration. So I struggle sometimes as a psychologist who spends his everyday life training students, working with other academics, writing academic articles. It's really hard to translate these ideas into legible language and concepts for the public. And we shouldn't expect academics to do that work naturally or on their own either. So collaborating with people who work in PR, in strategic comms, in advertising, in graphic design, and in the movements, most importantly, is one of the most important ways that I think social scientists can make a real impact. We don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders or presume that our intelligence and credentials are all the expertise we need to be in the movements. What we need is humility, collaboration, interdisciplinary, and public work so that we can work in coalition with others. I hope that answers your question, but those are some of my thoughts on how we can play a role in fighting misinformation, polarization, and other kinds of ills that face our public discourse today.
Laura, are you seeing signs of that collaboration from your vantage point of those opportunities for synchronicity and coalition building?
Definitely, at Six, we within my team, specifically the reproductive rights team, we do have a research team, very small but mighty, two people, but right, we're serving 650 plus legislators, and as Patrick said, we really need just a way to meet legislators where they're at. They can't be expected to be experts in every field. And, we need science that's not only produces strong evidence, but also considers, how that evidence can be applied in a fast moving environment. And specifically, I think like the work that you're already doing, Patrick, and starting this year, kind of doing the review of the 300 plus citations on this study from 1992 on post-abortion syndrome, I think is something that would be very beneficial for legislators to kind of use that and in their arguments, right? And kind of use that to debunk a lot of the misinformation that's coming through, specifically as some states look to further ban abortion. And I think this is right, the type of data that really supports human rights-based policy. In addition to research too, I'm very curious about the framework, the human rights framework specifically. When I think about our international delegations that we did to Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries use that framework and they have such an ease in connecting with the children's rights movement in their countries too. I would be curious to see kind of the research that we could do around kind of disarming this parental rights movement and really bringing to the forefront and center, which is young people and letting them lead. And how can we do that in a way that centers the most impacted, but then is able for legislators to not feel like they need to fight back against parents, but also include them in this. So messaging that welcomes, parents, all types of parents, right? And all types of children too, to be included in this movement. I think it's the coalition building that we need for our future, right? We can't just continue the same old practices that unfortunately are not working. Like, who are the folks that we need to bring in? And I think, human rights researchers and scientists are the type of folks that we need to help translate a lot of the research and bring it not only to legislators, but to folks in the community and the constituents of legislators.
I have so many ideas and so many questions. One of the first things that I keep thinking about is this post-abortion syndrome article and your research on it and how much harm it appears to be doing. Do you know if there has been a call to retract the article, Patrick, and what the response to that call has been?
It's interesting that you raised this question, which has been part of my concern about post-abortion syndrome or PAS really for the past, I suppose, 18 months. So I'll try to keep this brief, but I'll tell you a little story, which is that as was preparing my presidential address, which I gave to the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues in June 2024 in Philadelphia. As I was preparing for the address, a colleague of mine, Lisa Rosenthal, a professor who you know, Asia, at Pace University in New York, sent me a new paper that was sort of an uncovering of the history of post-abortion syndrome, including that it had been published in our flagship journal, JSI. And she said, "Did you know this?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I feel like if I'd known it, I would have talked about it every single day of my professional life. But I had no idea. Of course, I knew about post-abortion syndrome, Laura, just the way that you know about it, that it's sort of carted out as this scientifically legitimate explanation for why we should restrict people's right to one of the safest medical procedures we've got in American medicine." So as I started thinking about it, post-abortion syndrome and its history became part of my presidential address and thinking about the ways that psychologists can facilitate justice and can also contribute to injustice. And after I gave the address, a lot of people said, "Well, we got to get it retracted. We have to do something to stop this." And I'm not going to say, Asia, that I know where this story ends. So I'm not going to tell you that the PAS piece will never be retracted. But retraction is really complicated. And unlike the way that politicians talk about science, science is really thoughtful and careful and doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's imperfect, but it's the best thing that we've got in terms of how we evaluate evidence, conduct analyses, and produce knowledge. And when it comes to the 1992 PAS paper, it doesn't appear that research misconduct, as federally defined, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, is at play in the manuscript. I don't understand how it got through the editorial process, and it certainly seems like it wasn't reviewed by, or the editors didn't take seriously the concerns of experts in sexual reproductive health but somebody reviewed it and found the arguments convincing. And I'll tell you that when my students in my research team read it, they were so surprised at how convincing the paper is and how their use of previously published data and of clinical sounding language makes this sort of sober case for the concept of post-abortion syndrome. And they could see, they could sympathize with people who took the argument seriously because of how convincing they found the original paper. I thought that retraction might be the way forward, but the other thing that's weird about the internet age, not to make myself sound like I'm 150, but the thing about the digital travels of scholarship is that we could retract the paper potentially, but it will still live on. And retraction doesn't eliminate all of the existing citations or all of the court cases that have relied upon post-abortion syndrome to justify abortion restrictions. And so, from that perspective, I'm not sure what retraction would really do if rectifying the harms that the original PAS publication has caused is our goal. So, with careful deliberation with members of the society's leadership, the editorial team, it's called the Publications Committee, and with other scholars who I trust, we weighed a bunch of different options. And for now, this is the best thing that I know how to do, Asia, which is kind of to go to work rather than say, I want that article scrubbed from the internet. What I think I want to do is make sure that anytime anyone goes to see that article on the journal's website, I hope that they'll see our systematic, thoughtful, sober account of how that piece has been used right next to it so that they can make their own decisions, informed decisions about the work. One of the things that scares me, Laura, when I think about the really complicated strategizing that you have to do in communicating with legislators, is that I wonder how saying that the post-abortion syndrome paper is wrong could be weaponized against us, like as an excuse to throw out all science. Like, so if you want to say that that paper is wrong, then maybe the Turnaway study is wrong, right? And the landmark research that has really been so important to the pro-abortion rights movement and the reproductive justice movement more broadly, showing that actually what causes harm to people is not being able to get the care they need. I think there's a lot of both sidesism, there's a lot of false equivocation that happens, whereby if you say that some science gets it wrong, the next thing out of your opponent's mouth is, well, everything is really opinion and all science is just a bunch of opinions. So I think we have to be really careful. And I have learned about myself that I like a good fight, Asia, but I don't like to go into it without all the information that I need. And I like to move slow in some ways. That doesn't always work great with activism, but I am who I am. And I only know how to do the work like this, which is to take my time and know what I'm talking about and then construct a careful argument. I used to think when I was younger that I wanted to be a pundit, but I think I was delusional. I just want to do the work that I do, which is to talk with people like this carefully and thoughtfully about things we care about.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I think I'm going to leave the last question to Laura, and it's about, doing what you know how to do and using your expertise. What do you need from scientists working on reproductive justice in order to do your work well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Referencing what Patrick said, it's, what we need the most is translation, right, of a lot of these materials and not only produces strong evidence, but also considers how that evidence can be translated in fast-moving policy environments, right? These legislators are making decisions under pressure, and it's really important to kind of have this information readily available. And I know there's a lot of great coalitions already that are working and supporting and doing the best to meet the moment, which means, right, focusing on clarity, relevancy, and timing of a lot of these, articles and research. And what's really important for legislators is not only just a peer-reviewed article, but maybe sometimes just a powerful sentence that is backed by research and helps them really defend their vote or to persuade a colleague or, respond to any opposition claims as well. I think that's the most important and thing that they can use and have in their pocket in this moment, in this time, and continuing to build upon the partnership within academia. How can we go beyond the spaces of academia to reach out to reproductive justice organizations on the ground? Can there be, an academic that's doing this work joining the state coalition, right? Kind of listening to the folks that are working on the ground and being like, okay, where can we see this going? And I understand that is happening, but then how can we also incorporate legislators into that mix so that they also feel like what they're hearing from their own constituents who are also impacted is being uplifted and kind of shared in the academia community too.
I think Patrick has his marching orders then. A powerful sentence.
100%. I'll take
Yeah.
it. I'll take it, Laura. I was nodding enthusiastically to everything you said. Rather than cancel ideas I don't like, I'd rather argue with good data against them. And I think we have to help legislators do that.
Any final thoughts or words from either of you?
I just want to thank all of the folks that are doing this such important research work right now. Folks, moving policy, whether it's through research, activism on the ground, just like it's all, it all matters, even if it's moving slowly from one perspective or not fast enough for us. I think in the end, I have hope that like the facts are with us and on our side. And so are our people, and we'll get there. It's going to be a rough time, but I'm hopeful that like if we stay aligned, we stay in solidarity and really leaning into each other's work and valuing each other's work, there's a lot of good that can come out of this.
I just want to underline what Laura said because it's all right. I've learned so much from the reproductive justice movement and the activists who lead it. They've changed my life. But one of the things that I tell my students and my colleagues all the time is the value of thinking about the long game, foregrounding the mission, reframing losses as the mitigation of even worse harms. I've learned from activists that burnout's not an option. You can't give up. And so sustaining yourself takes a real thoughtful and purposeful approach that to me is best engendered by working in coalition, collaborating together. So thank you for bringing us together for this conversation today, Asia and Laura. It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Ditto. It was wonderful being in conversation with you all. I learned so much.
Thank you both, and we'll end it here. Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.